Hi, and welcome to the Red Zone Warriors Fantasy Football Show. I am your host, Rob the Commish Smith, here along with my co host and residence Lions fan, Jay Cushman Corsel. The Jimmer was unfortunately unable to make tonight's show, and I hope we just didn't lose half our audience.
Yeah, maybe.
We'll try to step up our game. So, Cushman, how you doing tonight, buddy?
I'm doing well, doing well. Had a nice restful weekend, played a bunch of golf. Actually did par on 9 holes this weekend, so thank you, thank you.
Par on 9 holes and then quadruple bogey average the rest, or no?
No, no, no,
No, no,
not that bad.
okay. All right, we are pumped to be back. It's been a couple weeks. We're eager to talk to you about some fantasy football today. Don't forget, you can tweet us at Red Zone Warriors any fantasy football questions you might have. I know a lot of you guys out there are looking kind of your dynasty leagues are getting going. You're thinking about what your keepers are, so feel free to tweet us your questions. We'd be happy to talk about those on the show, so don't forget about that. On today's show, we're going to be looking at the pros and cons of various draft strategies based on some mock drafts that the Cushman and I did. The ones we're going to be looking at are, how does your teams turn out when you look at drafting quarterbacks late and streaming them in later rounds? How does your team pan out if you go wide receiver heavy early or running back heavy early? Or, is it worth taking Peyton Manning in the second round or Jimmy Graham in the first round? So we're going to look at those strategies and kind of discuss the pros and cons, as I know all of you out there kind of starting to think about mock drafting. Maybe you already done some mock drafts to kind of figure out which way you want to go in that regard. So, but in our next segment here, before we get to that, we're going to cover the latest news and notes around the NFL.
Andre Johnson and Vernon Davis are not participating in mandatory mini camps because they have sand in their vaginas. I don't think they get paid enough, I guess. I don't know. Possible holding outs for training camps. I don't know. Boys, go take a shower, get the sand out, get your asses to work.
Yes, that's definitely been affecting their ADP as well. We'll get to that in a little bit. So the Giants say they have found their, quote, bell cow running back in Rashard Jennings, the number 6 running back last year, actually, from weeks 9 to 16 as a starter for the Raiders. So, got to be careful about the coach speak here in the preseason, but according to them, they found their bell cow, and we'll see what David Wilson has anything to say about that here in the coming weeks.
Yeah, David Wilson says this. Ow! Ow! Oh, I got a crink in my neck. Can you help me with that? Anyway, Titans beat writer Mike Keith says that Dexter McCluster could be the Danny Woodhead in Ken Wisenhunt's offense this year. Well, if that's true, keep an eye on Dexter McCluster. But again, you never know with this kind of stuff. It is early. But Danny Woodhead was a beast in PPR last year, so I would definitely be interested in a clone of his type.
Yeah, Ken Wisenhunt has shown he can do that in the past. I mean, I think Woodhead was I believe wasn't he top 15 last year in
Absolutely.
PPR? Yeah, so
Absolutely. You can get higher than that.
yeah, keep an eye out on Dexter McCluster, kind of see what his ADP does here in the coming 6 weeks or so. No Sean Moreno was said to have shown up to camp, those mini camps that we discussed, overweight and out of shape. He also just had to undergo an orthopedic scope on one of his knees to clean it out, which is going to sideline him for at least 4 to 6 weeks. So we're going to talk about some ADP stuff here in a minute, but Lamar Miller is definitely someone to keep an eye out with no Sean. Not only is he out of condition and overweight, he just had to have the scope, so he's not going to be able to condition that much in the next 4 to 6 weeks as he's rehabbing that knee. So a lot of people were pretty high on him, so we got to be careful looking at him going into the season.
Yeah, the Packers would like to lessen the workload of Eddie Lacy. The only question I have to that is who else is going to run the ball? That's all you really have. So
Yeah, they just lost a guy out there. I think Starks would be the guy behind him. This is a guy that I had in a couple leagues last year. This doesn't really worry me too much. It might be better for his fantasy production at the end of the day. So they just want to make sure this guy's healthy for the whole season, especially probably in the playoffs. with their stud quarterback back. So they're just probably just something they say. This is pretty common, nothing to be too concerned about. Randy Moss is apparently adding coaching to his resume, becoming an associate head coach of Victoria Christian High School's football team, where his son plays in Charlotte. So you can add a little coaching to his resume and see if he can teach some of those wide receivers how to catch the deep ball.
Yeah, and Jordan Reed, speaking of somebody who I hope will be catching some balls this year, targeting him, is expected to be a key player in the Redskins' offense this season. That's according to team sources. No, wait, strike that. We just heard that Jordan Reed has attempted to put on a baseball cap and has suffered a concussion. Yep. 2014 season's gone. Sorry, Jordan Reed fans.
It's a bummer. It's a bummer. He was a good value. All right, it's been leaked. We should find out the result of Jimmy Graham's arbitration hearing sometime this coming week. For those of you who have been in a cave for the last couple months, this is a guy. He's basically had to go to an arbitration to find out how much, if they should pay him as a wide receiver or a tight end, essentially, when they put the franchise tag on him. So that's been arbitration. There's been different guys brought up for the hearing to discuss this and interviewed and so forth. And so we're supposed to hear the verdict. But even when the verdict comes out, both sides can appeal it, and I'm sure either side probably will. So we ultimately may not know for several more weeks. And this is pretty interesting because it's gone a little further than people thought. I mean, if he's designated as a wide receiver in the eyes of the NFL and the Saints have to pay him as such, then he is no longer a tight end in fantasy football for all intents and purposes, and that changes quite a bit. Instead of a top tight end by a long margin, he's in the 10 to 12 range as a wide receiver. So,
yeah, I hope that doesn't happen. I mean, I hope Jimmy gets paid, but I like him.
Yes, pay the man. It's the best player on your team.
Pay the man. Pay the man. He's worth it. Speaking of guys that hope to be worth it, Jerry Rice Jr. has signed a 3-year deal with the Redskins, undisclosed terms. They say he will still need to improve in special teams and his special packages to make the team. So that's going to be about it for the news and notes. Remember, kids, don't buy drugs. Become a pop star, and they'll give them to you for free. Back to you, Rob.
Justin Bieber it is. All right. That's it for the news and notes for tonight. We are going to be adding a new segment to the show starting tonight called the ADP Watch. The purpose of this is just to let our listeners know which guys are rising and falling somewhat significantly here as we get closer to most leagues beginning and as you guys are kind of preparing for your draft. So we've seen some different guys move quite a bit, even from 30 days ago. So Cushman, why don't you kind of take us through some of the guys who've made those big leaps both up and down? All
right, well, we're going to start off here with Arian Foster. He's now averaging the 8th running back off the board in mock drafts. That's a far cry from earlier this offseason. He was actually being drafted in the mid to late 3rd round. And really don't think you're going to get him in the 2nd. I think this guy's going to keep climbing up draft boards. He's got one of the, if not the easiest, schedule against defenses against the run in the league. He's bouncing back from this injury. I do not see him dropping much below early 2nd round. Noshan Moreno, we discussed earlier, he's now the 37th running back off the board in 12-team PPR leagues. In the 8th round, a little bit past the middle of the 8th round. A month ago, he was going 2 rounds sooner than that in the 6th round. We were talking about Lamar Miller, who is now being taken, or who was being taken in the 12th a month ago. He's now going 6 spots before Moreno in the 8th as of today. So he's going to keep going up. Moreno's probably going to keep going down. I wouldn't touch Moreno with the Comish's 10-foot pole, if there is such a thing. Another guy, Pierre Thomas, has climbed an entire round from a month ago from the 6th round to the 5th. Keep an eye on this guy. He caught 70-some balls last year. That's a PPR beast. And Cordell Patterson has jumped up 20 spots from the 5th in early June to the 4th now. I think this guy's overhyped. I mean, they say they're going to use him, but he's kind of small. I don't know. We'll see. I mean, Percy Harvin did all right in Minnesota. We'll see if they can, kind of do a little bit of that with some Cordell Patterson. That's all we got for you this week, though.
Yeah, if the Jimmers here would ask him if he still thinks it's worth taking his man-child, Cordell Patterson.
Well, the reason
Uh,
he's not here is he's at home right now masturbating to a picture of Cordell Patterson. So I'm sure he's still
well,
going to take him.
we all have our priorities. So,
Hey, you know.
all right, so let's go ahead and get into the drafting strategies. We're going to start tonight with late round streaming QBs. So basically, what we mean by that is when you're going into the draft, you have the mindset because quarterbacks are literally as deep as they may have ever been in the history of fantasy football. So you're going to say, you know what? I'm going to let all my buddies pick quarterbacks early, waste that value, and I'm going to wait till the eighth, ninth, 10th round, something like that, to grab a quarterback and then maybe back him up with somebody else, and you're going to stream those guys based on matchups. So as I mentioned previously, the Cushman and I did various mock drafts using these different strategies from various positions, like beginning, middle, and end of the 12-man mocks to kind of get a feel for what these teams would look like. So Jay, why don't you go ahead and discuss kind of what you think about this strategy, how your team turned out, and if this is something you're going to want to do in future drafts.
All right. Well, first of all, let's go over the team that I drafted when I did this. I drafted LaShawn McCoy in the first round, Julius Thomas in the second, which was probably a little early, Zach Stacy in the third, Crabtree in the fourth, Edelman in the fifth, MJD in the sixth, Kendall Wright in the seventh, Cecil Shorts in the eighth. Then I went with my first quarterback in the ninth round with Jay Cutler, who I do like this year. He's got Alshon Jeffrey and Brandon Marshall to throw the ball to, not to mention a decent tight end in Martellus Bennett. So I think, as long as they can keep him off his ass in Chicago and not hurt his feelings too much so he gets butt hurt and goes and sits on the sidelines and pouts, Cutler is going to be a decent fantasy option this year. And I took Phillip Rivers in the 11th. I was actually kind of hoping to get Dalton there a little, but he didn't drop to me. So I'm okay with Phillip Rivers. Between the two of these guys throughout the season, I think I'm going to have a really good chance at having a quarterback in that is going to at least give me, a decent shot at least getting real close to somebody that, say, has a Drew Brees or a Peyton Manning. I'm not going to score that kind of points, but I'm going to score solid points enough that I'm happy with my quarterback, especially the fact that I'm getting them in the 9th and 11th rounds. I do like the running backs on this team. What is there not to like about McCoy? And I really like the fact that I got MJD in the 6th. As we all know, he's in Oakland with Darren McFadden, but we all know that DMC is going to get hurt. Week 1, walking through the tunnel, somebody will throw like a hot dog wrapper or some shit down there. He'll slip on that and bump his knee, and that'll be it for 3-4 weeks for him. So MJD is going to be the man, plain and simple, in Oakland. I think going with the tight end early is a good idea in this aspect. Like I said, I think I took him a little early, but I like having a guy at tight end. Let me rephrase that. I'm starting to come around to the idea of having a really good tight end, somebody that just blows the other competition at tight end out of the water on a weekly basis. So, as long as Crabtree pans out, you got Crabtree, you throw Edelman in there. Kendall Wright and Cecil Shorts are two guys that saved my ass last year at wide receiver. I think they're going to do it again this year. And, if you can continue to get them later rounds, that's great. So I definitely always use this strategy with getting quarterbacks late. I'm not a guy that wants a stud quarterback on my team. I think you just got to take him too early. But we'll get into that later, definitely. I think this team is going to be competitive in most leagues, and I like the quarterbacks for sure. Rob, what do you think?
Yeah, you drafted out of the 2-hole in this 12-man league, so you're able to get McCoy. Zach Stacy obviously is somebody on the rise there. With MJD, somebody you don't even have to start, frankly, so that's good. Wide receivers are still good, even though you went with Julius in the 2nd, which is around early from ADP, but sometimes you just have to go after the guy you want, even if it is around early, but that's the case there. Yeah, if Crabtree should pan out, Edelman, I mean, he was a PPR legend last year. Kendall Wright, those guys. So you have really good PPR wide receiver. If this was a standard league, of course, you wouldn't have drafted these guys, but it's not. It's PPR league. So yeah, the team looks good. I mean, I was going to ask you, would you have felt better? You ended up getting Jay Cutler in the ninth round. Would you have felt more comfortable picking a QB one round early? In these kind of strategies, you're always guessing. You're looking at the other teams who's already drafted their first quarterback. Is there a chance somebody might take a second before you get your first? So when you play this game of waiting, you have to be cognizant of what's going on in the draft board and when to pull the trigger. Looking back at the draft board, you could have taken, I mean, you didn't necessarily know this at the time, but you could have taken a guy like Cam Newton or Kaepernick in the 8th round, which is still waiting late on quarterbacks and still following that strategy. Would you have felt better taking Newton or Kaepernick in the 8th and maybe getting Cutler or Rivers a round or two later?
Absolutely. I've done a couple more of these drafts, and like I said, this is always my strategy. I never go after early quarterbacks. So I have been kind of going a little earlier, 7th, 8th round, grabbing a Matt Ryan and a Kaepernick. Or actually, in one draft, I did get Cam Newton and Colin Kaepernick, which that would be a fun season, is having those two guys. A couple running quarterbacks, exciting to watch. Flipping them out, every other week. It would be a fun season, but I definitely would have felt better. Like I said, I'm not disappointed in Phillip Rivers. I mean, the guy's got, he's talented enough that he's going to put points up for you, but he's kind of inconsistent sometimes, and he's giving me a little indigestion thinking about having to actually play Phillip Rivers. But when you do the streaming quarterbacks, yes, you're eventually going to have to play him. Like last year, I had Tony Romo and Russell Wilson, and I actually just played Romo like most of the season up until the last game when I played Dalton, that I picked up 36 points. I know you remember that. It's a painful memory for me, little shithead.
Champion.
So yeah,
yeah, it's just so our listeners know, if they've never done this strategy. First of all, I would say this. I would say rank your quarterbacks and have a cutoff point, like because you do not need to draft two quarterbacks if you grab a stud, and your definition of a stud and mine might be different. So you might go 6 quarterbacks deep for your quote unquote stud, or you might go 7, or you might go 4. But if you go ahead and draft a QB like maybe in the 5th or 6th, and you're able to get a Stafford that falls or something, in certain circumstances, there's no need to waste a draft pick on a second QB if you feel rock solid at the guy that you chose. This strategy is for people who wait late, and it can be frustrating at times, frankly, because you're always debating every week, which guy do I play? And there's no question that some weeks you're going to choose the wrong guy, and maybe you lose your week because of it. If you would play the other quarterback, you would have won. So it is frustrating from that perspective, but from a value perspective, it is definitely the way to go. It's the way the Cushman drafts, and it's definitely the way that I draft. And let me back this up by looking at some numbers. Let's look at last year's numbers. So last year in 12-man leagues, Breeze's ADP was the 210. Okay, so basically towards the end of the second round is when Breeze was going, and he scored 358 fantasy points, and that's at 4 points per quarterback touchdown for those following at home. On the flip side, Andrew Luck's ADP was the 8-7. So that's, the middle part of the 8th round versus the end of the second round. And he scored 292 points, which if you break that down on a per weekly basis, which I recommend our listeners do, that's only a difference of 3.8 points per week that Breeze was outscoring Andrew Luck, getting him 6 rounds later. But the way to quantify this is you look at what are the players you could have got in Breeze's position if you, at the 210, instead of getting Breeze? You could have got guys like Demaryius Thomas, who, oh, by the way, was the number 1 wide receiver in PPR fantasy last year. You could have gotten DeMarco Murray, who, oh, by the way, stayed healthy for like 13 games and killed it. Andre Johnson caught like 100 and something balls. Those are the kind of guys you could have got instead of getting Drew Brees at the 210. And on the flip side, the best skill players you could have gotten after Andrew Luck, which again he went in the middle of the 8th round. These were guys like T.Y. Hilton, who had a pretty good year. but didn't nearly put up the numbers the other guys that I mentioned. And guys like D'Angelo Williams. Now, Demaryius Thomas outscored T.Y. Hilton by over 6 points a week. Okay, DeMarco Murray outscored D'Angelo by 6 points a week. So at the end of the day, would you rather have Drew Brees, T.Y. Hilton, D'Angelo Williams? Or would you rather have Andrew Luck, Demaryius Thomas, DeMarco Murray type guys? I think we all would rather have the latter. So I just said that just to make the point clear that, it's about, how many points per week your guys are going to score and what the value of these guys are at their positions. And the quarterbacks have never been so deep. So that was last year, but let's look at today's ADP. So those of you who are trying to figure out what strategy you want to put into this year, and if you want to wait to stream late QBs like we're advising you to do now, or if you think it might be better off to draft someone early. So today, for example, you would have to take Peyton Manning, which we'll talk about in a minute, that I actually did for purposes of this strategy in this podcast. You'd have to take him at the 202. Okay, so the beginning of the second round. And he averaged last week 25.6 points a week. Okay, but you have to remember, those were career high numbers for a quarterback. That's never been done before. That will not be done by him again this year. So it'd really be more fair to look at the next quarterback in the line, which was Drew Brees, and he was scoring about 22.4 points a week. Now, if you look at that and where he was going in ADP, you could get guys this season as you're drafting, guys like Julio Jones. Julio's going to average 20-something, low 20s a week. Antonio Brown last year scored 20 points a week on average. Giovanni Bernard, from a running back perspective, scored 14 points per week on average. You can get Cam Newton and averages 19 points a week last year, or Kaepernick that averaged 17 points in the 8th round. In the 8th round is where skilled players like Riley Cooper, Brandon Cooks, the rookie, and Fred Jackson are being drafted. So again, I ask, would you rather have Peyton Manning or Drew Brees in this regard, with Riley Cooper paired with Fred Jackson? Or would you think your team would be better off with Cam Newton and Kaepernick paired with a guy like Julio Jones, Antonio Brown, Arian Foster, or Giovanni Bernard? And again, I think we'd all pick the latter because that's what's going to be best for your team, because it's the best value. And at the end of the week, you're going to score more points by waiting on quarterback, getting that value, and instead drafting the skilled players early instead of these quarterbacks early because the position is so deep.
Yeah, absolutely. We've talked about this a lot, you and I, and when we first started using this strategy, which was basically right after we got into fantasy football, and nothing else makes sense to me. I see guys taking Peyton Mannings and Drew Breeses and Aaron Rodgers in the first 3 rounds every year, and every year those teams barely make the playoffs, or if they do make the playoffs, they're so weak at their other positions they end up getting just brutally brutalized. Yes, when they make the playoffs. So it's a strategy I won't employ.
Yeah, and let's not forget, guys, too, that Peyton Manning was getting drafted like in the 5th round last year.
Yep.
He was not going in the 2nd. So the guys that took a flyer on Peyton Manning and his neck issues and so forth, yeah, they hit gold, and that was fantastic. But again, they were drafting him in like the 5th round. So that's, you're going to have to take him at the beginning of the 2nd round if you want him this year. And again, he put up historic numbers last year, and history says that he will not repeat those numbers. So don't be that guy, unless your scoring is really different, or you're in a 2-quarterback league or something that changes this all together. If this is pretty much just a standard PPR league with normal scoring, even if it's 6-point touchdown scoring for quarterbacks, don't be the guy taking that, Peyton Manning in the 2nd. It's not the way to go. It's not the good value. And ultimately, your team is likely going to suffer unless you just get lucky during the draft and you're drafting with a bunch of homers that don't know what they're doing.
Yep. So I say we stop beating the dead horse here because
yeah. So let's
this
change.
is not strategy.
Yeah, we were clearly not for that. So let's switch to another draft that you did, Jay, where you drafted wide receiver heavy early. And this is pretty popular strategy. The reason for that, again, especially in PPR leagues, the wide receivers historically, they don't kill you like we saw last year. I mean, how many guys like Doug Martin and C.J. Spiller that just wrecked your fantasy world because they're running backs that went early. The guys, the wide receivers, they don't get hurt as often, and their value remains the same, and they consistently, like last year, I believe, actually in the history of fantasy football, I think the number is about 50% of the running backs drafted in the first round do not end up in the first round at the end of the season. That's significant, and that's risk. Wide receivers are not that way. They're much more every week. You know what you're going to get out of these guys, and again, they don't get hurt as often. So this is a strategy that gets used a lot, especially in high-stakes PPR leagues, and it's one that I've known many of people who've won their leagues by going this strategy. So, Jay, why don't you talk about your team and kind of the strategy in general about drafting wide receivers heavy early?
Yeah. So again, we'll go over the team real quick here. The first 2 rounds, obviously, in a wide receiver heavy early draft, I took wide receivers. Surprise, surprise. I was drafting from the 5 hole, excuse me, and I took Calvin Johnson with my first pick, 5th overall. I took Jordy Nelson in the 2nd round. Again, grabbing a tight end early with Jordan Cameron, probably a little early in the 3rd. My first running back was taken in the 4th round. I do not like this. Pierre Thomas, who I think is going to be great in PPR leagues this year, but I don't know about having him as my first overall running back. Then I went wide receiver again with T.Y. Hilton. Took another great PPR running back in Danny Woodhead. Basically what I'm looking at here, this isn't my favorite team that I drafted when we did this, and there's a few reasons for that. First of all, while Calvin and Jordy Nelson are going to be beasts in PPR, we all know this. It's foregone conclusion. I feel like my running back situation is way too shaky. It's going to be a huge headache all year. I mean, here's my running backs. I got Pierre Thomas, Danny Woodhead, Lamar Miller, Bernard Pierce, LeGarrette Blount, and that's it. So this is going to be a headache trying to get to choose the right guys to start every week. None of them are real high end. None of them are real sure starts. So that I feel it's just too weak. The only guy I really feel strongly about on this roster is Pierre Thomas, maybe Woodhead if he has another year like he did last year. My quarterback ended up being Andy Dalton, and I should have either A, have another quarterback, or B, I should have gone with a quarterback a little bit earlier instead of taking Bernard Pierce in the 9th. I should have taken Kaepernick or somebody who was there. Definitely. I just don't know. I don't know that Dalton can hold it down alone, especially with my lack of running back talent, to backfill his points with. So, kind of concluding my ideas on this draft, I've never really been a big fan of taking wide receivers early, and a lot of people disagree with me. That's fine. It's just my opinion. The way I see it is this: wide receivers are so deep in this league that I can get some really decent talent later on in the draft. So why should I not grab me a couple, borderline stud running backs, and maybe one receiver who's really good in the first 4 rounds, maybe 2, but definitely I'm getting a couple running backs early. I don't like this strategy very much, but that's just like I said, a lot of people disagree with me. That's my opinion. I'm a running back guy, whether I'm in PPR or standard leagues. So.
Yeah.
What do you think?
And I think one of the main reasons you may not have liked this team is because you pulled the trigger again early on a tight end.
Yeah, I agree.
And I know you've been going through that phase where you're kind of trying to figure out if you want to do that or not. And I think it might have hurt you here because you ended up taking Jordan Cameron in the 3rd round. And you could have, if you had, instead of Jordan Cameron, you could have gotten Zach Stacy or Andre Ellington at that pick. They were available to you.
No, they were not. That's going the other way. I'm looking at the draft board. That's why, because it was Doug Martin, Reggie Bush, and C.J. Spiller who were available to me there. And I think that's why
I see. Okay.
Yep.
Well, okay, yeah,
I don't want any part of Doug Martin, Reggie Bush, or C.J. Spiller. In all honesty.
Well, and that's fine, but I mean, okay, so yeah, I looked at it wrong, but I mean, Toby Gerhart. I mean, my point is, if you take an additional running back, like if you're not comfortable with those guys, maybe Toby Gerhart, somebody who's, streaming up the draft boards. He's probably going to get 300 touches this season. Or Shane Vereen, even for that matter, or the rookie Bishop Sankey, who's going to get a ton of volume. Had you added another running back there instead of Jordan, then would you have felt much better about this strategy?
Yeah, I absolutely would have. I think that you hit the nail on the head. If you're going to do a wide receiver early strategy, you're going to need to wait on a tight end, and I think that the rationale behind that is you're grabbing guys, you're grabbing receivers, and tight end is basically the wide receiver. You need to get, by the third round, you need to have a running back. I made a mistake there. I think in any draft, anywhere, ever, if you don't have at least one running back by the third round, you're going to be looking at a big headache all season long for sure. But like I said, Pierre Thomas and Danny Woodhead, there's a chance they may, be very good this year. Lamar Miller, we were talking about that earlier, without Moreno, and with Moreno looking like he's, deciding he wants to be fat and out of shape, and he's got knee issues. Lamar Miller may end up being a decent start at running back too. But again, call me a running back slappy. I like picking running backs.
No, I think if Lamar Miller hits. Had you waited, you actually pulled the trigger a little early on Jordan Cameron. You probably could have got him in the next round. But had you gotten a Toby Gerhart there, paired him up with Pierre Thomas and Woodhead, and Miller were to hit, you might have you'd have a pretty dynamic, competitive team there. So a lot of this time, you can go in with your strategy. A part of it is just, if the draft, quote unquote, falls to you, if you get the guys you're gunning for, that makes you more or less comfortable, with how you ultimately think this panned out. But it's definitely a strategy that people use for sure. But I think you're right at the end of the day. I think if you want to do that, I think you just have to kind of make the determination ahead of time that you're going to wait on tight end till later rounds and try to get those, Heath Millers or Kyle Rudolphs or Zach Ertz or something in the 8th, 9th, 10th round. And kind of
you can get Jordan Reed in the 8th, 9th round still, and I think Jordan Reed is, granted he gets over that concussion from putting his ball cap on.
I was going to say he's already out.
Yeah. I think he's going to be really dynamic this year if he stays healthy.
Well, and let me remind listeners too. A lot of these strategies also is make this determination a little bit based on your draft order. I mean, we can't forget that. You were drafting intentionally for the purposes of getting material for this podcast in the 5th spot, but if you're in the 1, 2, 3, even 4 hole, I think it's a ridiculous strategy. I think you just have to get one of those stud running backs. But if you're drafting anywhere from, 5, depending on how you feel about Eddie Lacy, maybe there, or Monte Ball or whatever, if you're drafting anywhere in the 6 through 12 hole, that's when this strategy might very well, be relevant for you. So.
Yeah, I agree. So we're going to go ahead and move on here. We're going to talk about my favorite strategy, and I didn't even get to draft it. You drafted this team. Running back heavy early. You actually did what I did last year and went running backs in the first 3 rounds. I'm really excited about this team. I want to hear what you got to say about it. I think it's a great team. So go ahead and give us your thoughts on this.
Yeah. So I've never. I'm in our league, the Red Zone Warriors League that we have. Cushman and Jimmer and I are in. That I'm the reigning champion, by the way. It's a keeper league, so you're allowed to keep 2 players in that league. So it's a little bit different. I don't think I've ever in any other leagues where that was not a keeper league, PPR or standard, that I've ever drafted 3 straight running backs. I don't think I've ever done it. In a keeper league, if I was keeping 2 running backs and I drafted a running back in that first round, it's just a different situation altogether.
It felt good, didn't it?
Yeah. So let's go over this team real quick. So I was in the 1 hole, so I was drafting first. I went with Jamal Charles. When it came back to me, of course I had to wait forever for that. I was able to get Alfred Morris, and I know he's not like a big PPR guy, but he's still a legit running back. He's going to get you a ton of points. And, at the end of the 2nd round in 12-man league, he's a great pick there. So I went Jamal Charles, Alfred Morris. Then I was on the turn, And I almost went. I would have. My gut said I wanted to go wide receiver there, but for purposes of this podcast and getting material, I decided to go ahead and pull the trigger on yet another running back just to see what would be available to me. Basically 2 rounds later when I was having to wait, for it to get back to me, I went ahead and picked up Andre Ellington. And Andre Ellington is, he's screaming up draft boards. People are nuts and crazy about him. I mean, they're talking about the head coach and offensive coordinator there in Arizona about basically constructing the offense, or at least the running game, around Andre Ellington. He's going to probably be a beast in PPR league. So, again, Jamal Charles, Alfred Morris, Andre Ellington. So when it came back to me, the next 3 picks, I was nervous, so I went wide receiver with all 3 of those picks. And I still was able to get Roddy White, who's a PPR giant. I know Julio Jones is back, but still, those guys are going to kill it again. Malcolm Floyd, who both me
Michael
and
Floyd.
I'm sorry, Michael Floyd. We're both super high on him. I mean, he's got a potential to be a top 12 guy.
He was amazing. He was amazing last, later part of last season. I actually had him on my team. He put up some pretty good points. He's a dynamic guy who can catch the ball. So.
Yeah, this is one of those. He's in his going into his 3rd year breakout candidates for just really crushing it. So I was able to get Roddy White, Malcolm Floyd, and then I was still able to get Emmanuel Sanders. And any wide receiver you can get in that Peyton Manning Denver offense is something something to look at. So I was able to do that, and then I went ahead. I got Jason Witten in the 7th round. I pulled trigger on quarterback in the 8th, which was still late streaming essentially, although I didn't draft the second one. I got Cam Newton. I still feel pretty comfortable with just keeping him alone. Noshawn Moreno. This was kind of before some of that stuff broke out about him. Anquan Bolden. Eric, tight end wise, I waited quite a bit to get those guys, but I think you still need to do in this philosophy. So anyway, at the end of the day, I think it was a pretty good team. It turned out surprisingly well, and again, that's to your point, Jay. Wide receivers are so deep, especially PPR just adds another probably 20 or 30 relevant wide receivers to the mix, unlike in standard leagues. So I clearly probably have, if Andre Ellington pans out, probably have the best running back core of the mock draft that I was in. And I was able to follow those 3 up with 3 really good PPR wide receivers, and then able to get another good PPR tight end with Jason Witten in the 7th, and wait and get that value for Cam in the 8th. So I think if Cam does have a decent year, which I still think he will, again, if you've heard us in previous podcasts, Cam has always finished in the top 5. He's always had a bad set of wide receivers around him. That's just the nature of the Carolina offense for some reason, unfortunately. So I don't think he's any worse off than he was the previous 2 or 3 years from a wide receiver perspective, and he's always finished top 5 because of what he does with his legs and his rushing touchdowns. So if he finishes above his ADP, which I think he will, getting him there was a good value, and I think this team would be incredibly consistent.
Yeah, I agree. When I saw you go 3 running backs, I was like, whoa, here we go. I mean, like I said, I did it last year. It wasn't something I planned. I usually go running back in the first 2 rounds and grab a couple wide receivers, but I went running back in the first 3 rounds, and lo and behold, I made the championship last season, later losing to Dickhead over there. But look, the first 3 running backs here are obviously good. They were the first 3 picks. What really surprised me a lot was the depth you were able to grab at the rest of the positions here. I mean, we already talked about these wide receivers. Roddy White, Michael Floyd, Emmanuel Sanders. These guys all, well, at least Roddy White and Michael Floyd. I'm not super high on Sanders. Like you said, he's part of the Peyton Manning offense, so he's going to score points. How many is the question. But Roddy White and Michael Floyd, man, great wide receivers. Grabbing Bolden in the 10th. And Miles Austin in the 14th. That's an interesting pick, Miles Austin in the 14th round. He's in Cleveland now. I mean, Josh Gordon's gone. We don't know what the quarterback situation there is really going to be, but somebody's got to catch the ball. So, I think I'm kind of hoping that it's going to be Jordan Cameron and Miles Austin. Be kind of nice. I really, really like this team, though. Like you said, if Roddy stays healthy, Michael Floyd has the season we're predicting, then your wide receiver 1 and 2 are solid. And you can throw Sanders in if one of them's struggling. So, this is by far and away my favorite way to put a fantasy team together. I've used this philosophy over and over. It helps me win championships. Wide receivers super deep. I mentioned that earlier. Running back, not so much. So, there's like wide receivers. There's usually two guys on every single team in the NFL. There's usually two receivers on every team that you might be able to plug into a fantasy lineup and get some decent production out of. Most teams do not have two running backs that you're going to get decent production out of. They've got one. Sometimes they do running back by committee, which is even more of a fucking nightmare. So I think it's a much safer gamble to take a lower tier wide receiver later, get your running backs earlier, because you do not want that running back by committee, and you do not want to be stuck starting a second string running back as your running back too. Because you're not going to like the outcome of that for sure. And just to add one more thing here, part of my other reason with this, I hate handcuffs. I never draft guys handcuffs. To me, it's a waste of a roster position. So, again, my opinion, opinions are like assholes. Everyone's got one, and they usually stink.
Yeah. I think at the end of the day, I think it's nice to at least get a guy at the running back and wide receiver position that you can hang your hat on, you feel comfortable leading your team with, and you fill those other spots with upside guys. I mean, I think we've talked about this in the past, but I think this year especially, just given the depth at wide receiver and so forth, I mean, I think if you have to suffer at any position, I'm not too. I mean, you probably differ about this a little bit just because you're a little bit more wide receiver heavy than me. But I don't mind suffering a little bit at the running back 2 position, depending on how many flex spots you have and that sort of thing. But if you're playing a standard start 2 running backs, 2 wide receivers, 1 flex, a tight end, and so forth, I think suffering a little bit or going for those guys in later rounds that could break out, or maybe grabbing somebody off the waiver wire, which always happens every year. The RB2 position is where you can at least come out of your draft seemingly a little weakened and ultimately be completely fine. But if you're playing in leagues where you have multiple flex positions and so forth, then that might change your strategy a little bit. But we'll kind of get into that later. So,
yeah, well, like I said, it's my favorite way to do it. It's worked really well for me. I like getting those running backs that I don't have to worry about. Wide receivers, I get more of those off the waiver wire, it seems to me, that produce than running backs off the waiver wire. But we'll move on here. Talk about going from my most favorite to my least favorite. And we touched on this a little bit because we talked about waiting on quarterbacks and how both of us feel how important that is. Rob drafted a team. He was in the 11 hole on this here, and he drafted an early round stud quarterback. So just talk about it. Let's get this over with.
Well, I was surprised because I was actually a little pleasantly surprised. I thought it'd turn out worse than it did, but I think this draft was a little bit of an anomaly than how it would typically go for most of our listeners. I got a lot of the guys that I'm targeting that just happen to fall to me, and I don't think you can expect that in typical drafts. But so I intentionally picked out of the 11 because I knew I needed to get Peyton Manning at the end of the second, kind of on the turn. That's where his ADP is. So I drafted in the 11th spot. I went AJ Green, got that stud wide receiver, and I followed that up with Peyton Manning basically at the beginning of the second. But from there, when it came all the way back to me at the 3-4 turn, I was still able to get Alfred Morris and Zach Stacy, and I don't see
never happened.
Yeah, and that's just it. That when I was drafting it, I was like, hell yeah, I can't believe I could get these guys there. But Morris, fell to me at the 3-11 when his ADP is the 2-8, which is almost a round sooner. I got Stacy at the 4-2 when his ADP is the 3-1. So I essentially got both of these running backs a full round above where they're normally going. So again, this is an anomaly. It would have never happened, but the way that it did pan out I was of course pleased, and I would have been thrilled to actually draft this team in real life. But I would never risk drafting Peyton Manning in the second thinking that this sort of thing was going to happen. So anyway, so I got As like I said, I got Alfred Morris in the third, Zach Stacy in the fourth. I pulled trigger on my tight end, get one of the top 5 guys. I got Vernon Davis in the fifth. So then wide receiver perspective, I got A.J. Green, the stud, in my first pick. I followed that up with T.Y. Hilton, Golden Tate, Ruben Randall, Kenny Stills in the 11th, guys. Miles Austin again in the 13th. I feel like I have pretty decent depth behind my stud A.J. Green. And from a running back perspective, I was able to get Lamar Miller in the 8th. Again, a guy who's rising in draft boards because of Noshawn. I got Christine Michael, the heir apparent in Seattle, to Marshawn Lynch. And I just threw some darts at Trey Mason in the 12th and so forth. So at the end of the day, the team ended up better than expected. But again, I wouldn't expect this in reality. And I gave up getting guys like Le'Veon Bell, Arian Foster, DeMarco Murray in order to pick up Peyton Manning at the beginning of the second. I could have got one of those guys, and I could have waited, and I could have gotten Cam Newton or Kaepernick in the 8th or Cutler in the 9th. And again, that's what we're going to preach to you, is that waiting on your quarterbacks and getting those other skill positions in early rounds is the way to go.
Yeah. He just hit it. We're going to preach this over and over again. Do not, under any circumstance, take a quarterback in the first, second, or third round. If you do, you should just stop drafting, go home, and play fantasy baseball or something. I don't know. I really don't. This is not my. I will never do this strategy. I've never liked this strategy. Your first 3 picks on this team, were good if you like having that stud quarterback. I mean, getting Alfred Morris, like you said, though, getting Alfred Morris in the 3rd and Zach Stacy in the 4th round is never going to happen. It's just not going to happen. Not in an actual draft with people who are actually competing for real money. Those guys are not going to drop that far. So I never take a quarterback before the 5th round. I just think there's too much talent available in those rounds. And there's so much talent in the quarterback position. You can get, like you said, Kaepernick, Cam Newton, freaking Jay Cutler, Phillip Rivers, Matt Ryan in the 7th round. Too much, man. I'm starting to get upset just talking about this, really.
Well, and again, Peyton Manning's not going to have the year he had last year. So you're talking about, if you draft a quarterback in the 2nd round somewhere, he's probably going to get you roughly 22 points a week. Guys like Matt Ryan who are going to come back from the down season last year, guys like Kaepernick and RG3 who are on the rise. I mean, they might, at the end of the day, outperform Drew Brees, or at least get within 1 or 2 points a week on average. And if they do that, then it was clearly a crucial mistake that you made, trying to get a leg up on your competition by drafting a QB that early. That's just plain as day.
Abso-freaking-lutely, dude. That's it. Okay, week 2, Peyton Manning scoring a bunch of points. Yes, but you've got a quarterback that you drafted in the freaking 8th round that's only scoring 4 or 5 points less than him, and the running back that you drafted in the 2nd round instead of Peyton Manning is scoring 8 or 10 points more than the running back that the guy who's got Peyton Manning drafted in the 8th round. I mean, you're gonna net points by not taking a quarterback early. I firmly believe it. I think the numbers bear it out.
Yeah. And again, remember, Peyton Manning was not drafted in the 2nd round last year.
Exactly.
So his value is now gone, and he's going to decline. Period. This year from last year. When he followed, I think he threw like 55 touchdowns this season. He's done this in the past where he threw close to 50 or the highest that he's ever thrown. He followed that up the next year with like 28, 29 touchdowns. So we've actually seen this happen before, not just with him, but with other QBs. It just, the law of average just says it's not going to happen.
Back a couple of years ago, man. What he threw like 30-something touchdowns one year, comes back the next year, and him and Calvin both didn't get near that many touchdowns.
Yeah, you can't bank on that for sure. So
it's not a position I'm willing. There's too damn much talent available to waste an early round pick on a fucking quarterback. And I will fight anybody that says anything different. You can get a hold of it. at Red Zone Warriors, Red Zone Warriors Fantasy Show at gmail.com. Bring in the hate mail, baby. Fuck early round quarterback.
There it is. All right, so the last strategy we're going to look at is one that the Cushman's been very intrigued by of late. And he did some draft to kind of see how his teams would pan out. And this is, can you draft tight ends kind of early and heavy and still have a well-rounded team that will produce for you? Yes or no? So, Jay, what do you think about how this team you picked out of the 6 hole with tight end early in mind?
Well, I was going to say that I am almost sold on this strategy. But the more I look at it, the more I think about it, still very much on the fence. I did a couple of drafts with this strategy in mind, and the teams looked like this. All right, I had the first one I did. I took Jimmy Graham in the first round. I took Arian Foster in the second. Julius Thomas in the third. I ended up with Michael Floyd. I got Stafford as a quarterback in the fifth. MJD in the sixth. Woodhead in the seventh. Sammy Watkins, Mike Evans, Tavon Austin, LeGarrette Blount, and so on and so forth. It looks like a pretty decent team to me, but it definitely suffers at running back and wide receiver. That's my problem, is looking at this, as I've stated before, I'm a very big fan of getting good running backs so that I don't have to, do much guesswork with that. The second league I did, I actually went and freaking drafted 3 tight ends for this team. Now, I'm going to mention that this draft, I did this in mind for a team or a league that has, you can play a tight end and it has 2 flex positions that both can have tight ends. So I would technically be able to play all 3 of these guys every week. I drafted Jimmy Graham, Julius Thomas, and Vernon Davis. Jimmy in the first, Julius in the third, Vernon Davis in the sixth. My wide receivers are Wes Welker, Michael Crabtree, Terrence Williams, Brandon Cooks. My running backs are Le'Veon Bell, Ben Tate, Frank Gore, and D'Angelo Williams. Again, decent team. Not something I'd be jumping up and down or roster rating over. I think you really, when drafting early tight ends, you have to incorporate a late round streaming quarterback strategy for sure. And you need you got to wait on tight ends. Here's the thing: you got to take Jimmy in the first. Don't do what I did and take Julius Thomas in the third or Vernon Davis in the sixth. Wait on guys, grab a Jordan Reed, a Zach Ertz late, maybe even take a gamble on Eric Ebron, Bennett. Kyle Rudolph, I think, is going to have a good year this year. You can get all those guys later so that in that third and sixth round, like in the third round, I could have had Jordy Nelson. Or no, I could not have. I could have had Randall Cobb, Pierre Garçon, Larry Fitzgerald, Vincent Jackson, Wes Welker. And any of those guys, I think, is probably actually going to put up more points on a weekly basis than Julius Thomas. In the sixth round, I could have had Michael Floyd. I could have had Emmanuel Sanders, Kendall Wright. I could have had Joique Bell, Rashad Jennings. So there's definitely talent to have there. I don't know if taking those tight ends early. Get Jimmy early. He's going to be the guy you stick in your tight end position that's going to knock the ball out of the park for you every week and outscore whoever you're playing against in that position. But wait on your tight ends a little bit later, and I think this position has some merit. I think it can be, definitely used. Grab Jimmy Graham and a couple running backs right away, and then go wide receiver heavy for a while. Grab a quarterback and then some more tight ends. See what it looks like. As a matter of fact, after we get done with this, I might hop back on and do another mock draft just to see what it looks like. But yeah, I like it somewhat. I'll have to get back to you on whether or not I think it's definitely something I would use. You know me, Rob. I've never been somebody that wants to pick a tight end early. I've always preached against it, as a matter of fact. That might change a little bit, but I don't know if I'm going to go real heavy on tight ends yet. I don't know if I'm sold on that. What do you think?
Yeah, I think what we learned from this is that, and I'm more comfortable. I'm similar as you. I was kind of against it and scared to go Jimmy Graham in the first round historically. I think if you're going to go, tight end early, I think you get Jimmy in the first. and then that's it. Like you don't need to draft another one. I think what happens is there's within the different positions, the skill positions, there's guys that you hear names and you get excited about those guys because of their brand recognition. Guys like Julius Thomas, guys like Vernon Davis, they're studs at their position, but when you look at what they do point wise per week, there's a couple dozen of those at the other positions putting up those same points per week. So even though the name recognition is big and you're like, holy crap, I got these studs, they're not necessarily outperforming wide receivers. They're not actually outperforming a lot of wide receivers and running backs that are drafted at that same ADP. So the point is and that's under the circumstance if you have multiple flex positions that I don't recommend necessarily drafting those tight ends to put in these multiple flex scenarios.
No, I agree. I think that's exactly what happened to me. As I was kind of looking at the strategy a little bit, and I'm like, man, you could really do this. But then I'm thinking, and it actually is what happened is the name recognition. I'm like, well, Jimmy Graham, Julius Thomas, Vernon Davis, these are all guys that were top 3 in their position, minus Tony Gonzalez, who's obviously retired. I was like, well, that's like 50, 60 points a week. Well, if you actually do the math and look at their averages per week, it's more like 20, 40 points a week, which I think you're right. You're going to get more production out of having a wide receiver or a running back in that position. I think, you might want to do this if maybe you get to a point and you're picking and you're looking for a guy and you're like, well, I can either take this guy, Kenny Stills, say, in the 12th round, or Zach Ertz, which one of those guys is going to put up more points? Maybe, but that's, stretching it, I think.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's just so let's just look at it. So from a point perspective, Jimmy Graham this season or in today's ADP is right now going at the 108. So you definitely have to take him in the first round if you're gonna get him. So if you're in a draft spot that's in the middle towards the latter part of the first round, he's an option for you. And last year he scored 19.2 fantasy points per week in a PPR league. Other skill players going just after him in current ADP are guys like Dez Bryant. He scored 18.4 last season. AJ Green scored 19.5, more than Jimmy did. Brandon Marshall 19.1. So all these guys are scoring just about the same at various different skill positions, but the difference with Jimmy Graham is you are gonna dominate at your tight end position hands down. Like, we're not talking about flexes and stuff. We're talking about you have to play a tight end in every week, and Jimmy is gonna dominate your opponent that week, probably by 6 or more points in a given week every single week. And
let me stop you right there. That's a good point. And what if? And I'm just this actually just kind of popped in my head here. So what if you take Jimmy Graham first overall, not to play him in your tight end spot? Do what I normally do and take a tight end later in the draft. Somebody like a Greg Olsen, a Jordan Reed, somebody like that who you're going to throw in your tight end position and maybe battle it out. But what if Jimmy Graham is actually one of your flex plays?
Well, I think at the end of the day, you're still got to total the points your guys scored.
No, I agree. I agree. But having Jimmy Graham in your flex would be, I don't know. You're right, actually. It's total points scored, but that's still an interesting.
Yeah, I hear you. And like Julius Thomas, for example, his current ADP is the 3-4. He averaged 13.6 points a week last season. So let's compare that. So Jimmy averaged 19.2. Julius Thomas, who's the second tight end off the board, averaged 13.6. So we're talking, like 6 points, 7 points difference just by those two guys alone. That's why Jimmy's such a stud, and that's why, picking him in the first round, in the middle or latter part of it, is worth it. But if you, instead of getting Julius Thomas in the third, you could get guys like Zach Stacy. He averaged 15.3 points last year, 2 points more than Julius Thomas. Pierre Garçon, you could get instead of Julius Thomas in the third at the end of the third round. He averaged 5 more points a week than Julius Thomas did. Keenan Allen, you could get there. He averaged like a point more than Julius Thomas did last season. So then you look at guys like Vernon Davis. Well, you can get him in the 6th. Is he still a value there? Well, he averaged 13.7 points a week last season. You can get Kendall Wright, who's averaging the same amount. You can get Danny Woodhead, who averaged more than Vernon Davis did last year in a PPR. So I think that's all being said. I think that's an argument for waiting on tight end, getting skill position. There's several guys there who can put up just the same amount of numbers or better, especially you hit on a Pierre Garçon or somebody who just kills it, and all of a sudden you're outperforming that position by 6 or 7 points. Greg Olsen is going a round and a half later than Vernon Davis, at the end of the 7th round. You can get him, and he scored 11.9. If my tight end scores me almost 12 points a week, and I got him at the end of the 7th round, and this is in a 12-man league, I am thrilled. Absolutely thrilled. Because I got him at the end of the 7th versus wasting a draft pick on a guy like Julius Thomas, who only outscored him by basically 1.5 per week, and I will take that all day and twice on Sunday.
Yeah. Now, that's what I was asking is, like, you take, like you said, wait and take your Greg Olsen, who's going to score your 12 points a week in your tight end position. You're happy with it. What I was asking is, would you take Jimmy Graham first overall anyway and not even use him as a tight end, put him in as a flex play?
Yeah, I just think that.
Do you think it's worth your first overall pick to have a guy that's going to score you 20 points a week in your flex position?
Yeah, I just have to think that through. I don't know if it matters at the end of the day again, just because you have to. It's just a matter of total points at the end of the. To answer, Jimmy Graham, of course, is probably going to outscore your opponent in the flex position by a large margin, just like he would if he was your starting tight end at the tight end position. Whereas the tight end if they both hit, if the tight end that you got late hit, and he outscored your opponent's tight end every week on average, or at least the 10 weeks that 11 weeks you're not having to play Jimmy Graham. Of course, he's on your own team, but some other stud of that caliber, then it's probably a win all the way around. It's just more or less a gamble.
Yeah. Well, the other thing I was thinking too with this strategy, and I think which is actually the most appealing part to me, is you get to name your team like Tight Ends Are Us or Tight End Smorgasbord, if you will. That to me that's the biggest draw for the strategies.
Yeah.
Witty name.
Well, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Gronkowski here because
Yeah.
I have to do it. The guy, he's as talented, or some people would say he's more talented than Jimmy Graham. If they play a 16-week season, they would bet that Gronk would, potentially outperform. I think he's done it in the past.
If they play a 16-week season, Jimmy Graham can do that.
Yes, and that's just it. We all know that's just it about Gronk. But if because of that, Gronk's ADP has dropped than what Jimmy is, and as we get closer to the season, we'll know. But if his ADP is still in the third, fourth round, and he ends up playing sooner than we thought, and he plays more games than you think, then his value there will ultimately pay off. But that you're rolling the dice.
I drafted him in the set, as you know, because I traded him to you. I drafted him in the 7th round last year, and I was like, all right, Gronkowski in the 7th round. This guy, last year before the season started, they were like, oh, he's going to be out, 4 weeks probably. Then it turned to 6, and he didn't come back till like 11 or some shit like that. I traded him to you. You still had to wait like 4 weeks to play the son of a bitch. You gotta mention him. He's a fucking amazing tight end. If the guy can stay healthy, and you can get him in the 7th round. You're running around freaking mushroom stamping everybody's head all season long, for sure. But let's be honest and real and just say it. Gronkowski is not going to probably play the whole. He's probably not even going to start this season. So who knows when he's going to start? I wouldn't touch him.
Yeah, I'm a little nervous of him too. He's coming off multiple surgeries. I would not be surprised at all if he ends up on the PUP list to start the season, which is a mandatory deal that he's out for 6 games like he was last year. So I'm kind of a guy I'm staying away from. In FFPC formats where you're getting 1.5 per reception for tight ends, so you're getting an extra half point, versus wide receivers and running backs per catch. That might change it a little bit, and that might change your strategy altogether. I'll give a little shout out to my buddy Chris Banks. He played, I think, 200 of these leagues last year, where it was 1.5 per tight end. So that changed your strategy altogether, and he drafts tight ends early and often, and you can't blame him for that.
That's Chris Banks at I Play Fantasy.
On Twitch, absolutely. I Play Fantasy. It's a great listen. You learn a ton, especially for those people. He designed his whole Twitch setup around helping people like you and me who are, played multiple years, maybe just with our buddies and neighborhood and people like that, and want to branch off into playing high stakes leagues. So the Cushman and I are actually going to co-own a team in FFPC this year, so we'll kind of let our followers know how that goes and how that's different and how you draft differently, and just how much harder it was or isn't or whatever than what we thought, and so forth, as we explore that new option. So anyway, I think that's it for our show this week. On our next show, we'll be talking about daily fantasy leagues. This is kind of where this seems to be going, and all these people are excited about these daily fantasy leagues. I know Jay dabbled in this for the first time last season. So, what are daily fantasy leagues? How do they work? How's the strategy different when you play these versus what you do on an every, week basis in redraft leagues? So we're going to kind of get into the meat and potatoes of playing daily fantasy and break that down for you. Kind of on a side note here, we'll also be giving away a free entry into a $25 league at Derby City Fantasy, or actually derbycityfootball.com. So derbycityfootball.com will be giving away a free entry into one of their $25 leagues. So keep an eye out on our Twitter account at Red Zone Warriors to find out how to win. We'll be doing some promotions here in the next couple weeks before our next live show. So in the meantime, go to redzonewarriors.com, where you can watch all of our previous episodes, see our rankings, and subscribe to our show via iTunes. And don't forget to follow us on Twitter and tweet us all your fantasy football questions at Red Zone Warriors. So for the Cushman, I am Rob, the Commish Smith. And remember that if you are taking a fantasy off season, then you are already losing. So thanks for tuning in, and we will see you next time.